Hello Daily Drafters and welcome back to the channel for the continuation of the Brothers War limited set review. Yesterday we took a look at black, and today we'll be taking a look at every single red card in the set. Don't forget that I am reviewing these cards before the set has released and before anyone has had a chance to play with them, so I will obviously be getting some of these cards wrong. But over the course of the entire format, you can tune back into the channel to see how I've adjusted the value of some of the cards over time. In addition to reviewing every single card in this set for Limited, I'll be producing archetype guides, pre-release primers, and other content related to the release of the Brothers War, so if you've stumbled across this video and any or all of that sounds of interest to you, feel free to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on all things Brothers War in preparation for its release. Lastly, before we dive in, I will be using the Limited Resources letter grade system to grade each of these cards here today, and if you're unfamiliar with that system, you can find that information in this video's description. Alright, with that out of the way, let's take a look at today's first red card. First up is Arms Race, which is 3 in a red for an enchantment at uncommon, and you can pay 3 in a red to put an artifact card from your hand onto the battlefield. It gains haste, and you must sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. This seems like a cute little sneak attack for some sort of Eternal format or cube with Blightsteel Colossus or something, but at 4 mana and 4 mana to activate, I just can't see any application for this card in the format. I'm giving it an F. Next we have Bitter Reunion, which is 1 in a red for an enchantment at common, and it says when Bitter Reunion enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards, and you can pay a generic mana and sacrifice Bitter Reunion to have creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. So if we think of this like a sorcery speed Thrill of Possibility with upside, does that make it sound any better than it looks? I think it does. It's a relief that blue-red is prowess and not just instants and sorceries in this format, because this will still trigger your prowess effects, and it sits on the battlefield to let you have one big turn later in the game. I think this card is actually quite good in the decks that want it. I'm giving it a C. Next up is Brotherhood's End, which is 1 and 2 red for a sorcery at rare, and you can choose one. It either deals 3 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, or you destroy all artifacts with mana value 3 or less. So you have to know which decks want this effect and which decks don't. Don't just jam this in a red aggressive deck and expect it to be good. In fact, it's probably at its worst in red-black because it goes against everything that deck is trying to do. I think this is either a red control card, which I'm not sure which red decks in the format would want that, or a situational sideboard B. Next up is Conscripted Infantry, which is 2 in a red for a 3/1 human soldier at common, and when it dies you make a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token. This seems fine in red aggressive decks that also have artifact synergies. I just don't think the card is outstanding or anything, and it's probably just filler or slightly below. I'll give it a C-. Our next card is Draconic Destiny, which is 1 and 2 red for an enchantment aura at mythic rare. It enchants a creature. An enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has flying, haste, and the ability to have +1/+0 for an additional 1 mana, and it's a dragon. And when it dies, you get to return Draconic Destiny to its owner's hand. Well, dang, this thing just never goes away. I mean, if they exile your creature or remove the creature in response to you targeting it with this card, it will go to the graveyard, and that is a noticeable downside. But what I see happening with this card is that they kill the first creature you put it on, then they save their next instant speed removal spell to kill the next target that you target with this, and then they'll finally get rid of it. But still though, that does throw a huge wrench in their game plan, requires 2 removal spells, one of them which has to be an instant. Now, it does have a downside of a 2-for-1 in their favor, but its upside is enormous. I think this wins a ton of games in the format, and I'm giving it an A-. Next is Dwarven Forge-Chanter, which is 1 in a red for a 1/3 dwarf wizard at common. It has ward, pay 2 life, and it has prowess. This seems like a really nice common in the prowess deck. We've seen 2 mana 1/3s with spell synergies in blue-red decks before, and they always seem to overperform. If you can draft 3 or 4 of these and get a couple on the battlefield at the same time, what are your opponents going to do about it? They're either going to lose life by targeting your 2-drop, or keep taking 2 or 3 damage to the face. I think this is going to play out about a C+. Next up is Excavation Explosion, which is 2 in a red for a sorcery at common. It deals 3 damage to any target, and you create a tapped Power Stone token. So here's one of red's premium removal spells at common. If we compare this to Lightning Strike from Dominaria United, we're paying an extra mana and having it be a sorcery instead of an instant in exchange for a Power Stone. I think that means it's not quite as good as Lightning Strike, but you'd still never cut a copy of this in a red deck. It's a B. Next up is the Fall of Kroog, which is 4 and 2 red for a sorcery at uncommon. You get to choose target opponent, destroy target land that player controls. The Fall of Kroog deals 3 damage to that player and 1 damage to each creature they control. For 6 mana, this is just way too expensive. Destroy a land, deal 3 to just their face, and then maybe kill like an X1 or something. I'd avoid putting this in your deck. I'm giving it an F. Next up is Falai Chaindancer, which is 3 and a red for a 2/4 human soldier at common, and you can pay 2 mana to have it gain double strike until end of turn. This is one of those cards that seems like it's fine on its face, but doesn't really have any sort of synergies in the format. It's one of the last 20 cards Wizard probably designed for the format. Yeah, just put a random 4 mana 2/4 with an okay ability in there, why not? Usually those cards aren't the end of the world to include, but they fall at about a D+, which is what I'll give this one here. Next up we have Feldon, Ronom Excavator, which is 1 and a red for a 2/2 human artificer at rare. It has haste and cannot block, and whenever it is dealt damage, exile that many cards from the top of your library, choose one of them, until the end of your next turn you may play that card. So we have a 2 mana 2/2 haste that can't block, that basically draw cards when it dies. It does slightly more than that with its second ability, but in limited it will basically just be when it dies. That's pretty good, a nice little aggressive creature that provides card advantage, which is exactly what aggressive decks need. This is a B. Next up is Giant Cindermaw, which is 2 and a red for a 4/3 dinosaur beast at uncommon. It has trample and it says that players can't gain life. Here's another one of those cards that seems quite good, but really doesn't have much synergy in the format. There isn't a dedicated life gain deck in this format, so its second ability probably won't come up as much as you might think. Maybe once or twice in an entire draft, but a 3 mana 4/3 trample is actually a really good rate. I think if you're aggressive, including a copy of this can do some good work for you. I'll give it a B-. Next we have Goblin Blast-Runner, which is a red mana for a 1/2 goblin at common, and it gets +2/+0 and has menace, as long as you've sacrificed a permanent this turn. Red is really shaping up to be a hyper-aggressive color with all of these super aggressive cards we've seen so far, including this one here. I've said this a lot so far in these set review videos, but you have to know which decks want this card, but in the decks that do, it's probably fine or slightly below fine, and that's about a C-. Next up is Horned Stoneseeker, which is 1 and a red for a 2/2 lizard at uncommon. It has menace, and when it ETBs, you create a tapped Power Stone token, but when it leaves the battlefield, you have to sacrifice a Power Stone. So a 2 mana 2/2 menace that makes a Power Stone is probably hugely important to this format. I think this is the cheapest Power Stone creator we've seen so far, and you can use that Power Stone maybe 2 or 3 times before this dies, and if you do, you've probably gotten all the value you need. In red aggressive decks, and especially decks that have Power Stone synergies, I think this is a B-. Next we have Mechanized Warfare, which is 1 and 2 red for an enchantment at rare, and it says that if a red or artifact source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +1 instead. Again, this might be the most aggressive start to a color in a set review I've ever seen before. I think this is a much more of a constructed card, because using an entire card that isn't even a creature itself for this effect just doesn't seem worth it. Now, if you resolve this, it'll create headaches for your opponents in some cases, but in other cases, maybe you only have 1 or 2 sources that care about this, and I think the latter is more likely. I'm going to go ahead and give this one a D. Next up we have Mishra Excavation Prodigy, which is 2 and a red for a 2/1 human artificer at uncommon. It has haste, and for 1 generic mana and tapping it, you can discard a card to draw a card, and whenever you discard 1 or more artifact cards, you add 2 red mana, and that ability only triggers once each turn. So there also seems to be several constructed-oriented cards in this set so far as well, and that seems to be another one of those right here. 3 mana 2/1s, especially without evasion, just don't really cut it nowadays. Now, this one does have haste, and you can use its activated ability immediately, and it's not a horrible ability. I think the last line of text on this is probably not too important to the power of this card, and I think that all makes it about a C-. Next up is Mishra's Command, which is X and a red for a sorcery at rare, and you can choose 2. Choose target player. They may discard up to X cards, then they draw a card for each card discarded this way. This spell deals X damage to target creature. This spell deals X damage to target planeswalker, or target creature gets +X/+0 and gains haste until end of turn. So I think the most common way you'll use this card is to remove a creature and rummage away a few cards. Occasionally, you might pump the power of a flyer or something as well, but you'll never use the Planeswalker mode. So this one doesn't have like quite as much modality as the other commands in the set that we've seen so far, but it still is an excellent effect, and it is a B+. Next up we have Mishra's Domination, which is 1 and a red for an enchantment aura at common. It enchants a creature, and as long as you control an enchanted creature, it gets +2/+2, otherwise it cannot block. You really never have space for cards like this. They're just never worth a full card slot in your deck. This is a D-. Next we have Mishra's Onslaught, which is 3 and a red for an instant at common. You can choose one. You either create 2 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature tokens, or creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. So here's our overrun effect in red, and 4 mana is just a lot. I don't think that a 4 mana to create 2 1/1s, even at instant speed, is necessarily worth it. You could include a copy of this and have it perform decently in the right scenario, but I think overall it's just a D+. Next up is Monastery Swiftspear, which is 1 red for a 1/2 human monk at uncommon. It has haste and it has prowess. This standard all-star is back with a vengeance. For just 1 mana, there's a possibility you could cast this like on turn 5, play 2 spells, trigger this on maybe another prowess creature twice, and then swing in for like 7 out of nowhere. I am definitely scared of this prowess deck from what I've seen so far, and I think this is a reason to get into it. I'm giving it a B-. Next up is Obliterating Bolt, which is 1 and a red for a sorcery at uncommon, and it deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and if that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. There's not much else to say about this excellent removal spell. The exile text is relevant, 4 damage is outstanding, and it's just 2 mana. This is a B+. Next up is Over the Top, which is 5 and 2 red for a sorcery at rare, and it says each player reveals a number of cards from the top of their library equal to the number of non-land permanents they control, puts all permanent cards they revealed this way onto the battlefield, and then puts the rest into their graveyard. Don't play this card. It's a huge trap. You're spending like 7 mana to give your opponent an enormous amount of permanents, even if you get them to. This is an F. Next up we have Pentagon Strongbull, which is 2 and a red for a 2/3 Minotaur at common. You can pay a generic mana and sacrifice an artifact to have Pentagon Strongbull get +1/+1 until end of turn and deal 1 damage to each opponent. This steep of a cost for just +1/+1 until end of turn and a small ping isn't worth it. Maybe it'll be easier to have sacrifice fodder for this than I'm imagining, but I'm starting it at a D. Next up is Pyrrhic Blast, which is 3 and a red for an instant at uncommon, and as an additional cost to cast this spell, you have to sacrifice a creature, and it deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to any target, and you draw a card. So we've got a fling here that tacks on 2 additional mana to draw a card. I think the best use for this is in prowess decks where you've already cast another spell or two and have a buffed creature, then maybe you can fling it at their face for lethal, at which point the card draw doesn't even matter. I don't think this card will find a home in decks in this format, so I'm giving it a D. Next we have Raze to the Ground, which is 2 and a red for a sorcery at common. The spell can't be countered, and you get to destroy target artifact. If its mana value is 1 or less, you draw a card. So the joke here is to destroy a Power Stone and draw a card. Is that worth 3 mana? I just don't know yet. I think that this will have enough targets most of the time to warrant including in the main deck, but not necessarily happily, because, again, the buyout is to just destroy a Power Stone and draw a card. I'll give it a C-. Next up we have Roc Hunter, which is 1 and a red for a 3/1 human soldier at common, and it has reach. Well, this is a pretty simple one. I'm not sure how many red decks will care about a defensive ability like reach on their creatures, considering how aggressive I think red decks will be, but I think this card actually gets a little bit of a knock because of how many 1/1 soldier tokens will be running around. Its minor upside and downside cancel out for me, and I'll give it a C-. Next up is Sardian Cliffstomper, which is 1 and a red for an 0/4 Minotaur Barbarian at uncommon, and as long as it's your turn and you control 4 or more mountains, it gets +X/+0, where X is the number of mountains you control. So we have a very, very defensive creature for the first, on average, like 8 or 9 turns of the game, at which point it becomes a 2 mana 4/4. But if you had a card in your deck that was a 2 mana 4/4 that you were guaranteed to draw on turn like 9 or 10, would you include it? I'm not sure I would. I think I need my cards to be very situationally great that late in the game. I think this is too slow to warrant inclusion. I'll give it a D+. Next up is Sibling Rivalry, which is 3 and a red for a sorcery at common. You gain control of target artifact or creature until end of turn, untap it, it gains haste until end of turn, and you create a tapped Power Stone token. I really hope this card doesn't end up being as good as Price of Loyalty was in AFR, and I have worries that it might be. I think that red-black has tons of way to sacrifice creatures, and this existing at common scares me a lot. There's a chance that the presence of this card in this format almost ruins the whole format, kind of like Price of Loyalty did in AFR. Now, there's also a chance that this deck isn't great and doesn't come together very well. I think I'll average it out to a C+ in that red-black deck, but keep your eye out on this card in the first week or two of the format. Next we have Tomakul Scrapsmith, which is 2 and a red for a 2/1 Human Artificer at common, and when it enters the battlefield you mill 3 cards. You may put an artifact card from among the cards milled this way into your hand. If you don't, put a +1/+1 counter on this card. So the fail case on this version of this effect is a 3-mana 3/2, which is much better than some of the other colors. You could also get a 3-mana 2/1 that draws a relevant card, and we all have recent experience with how good cards like that are. I'm looking at you, Inspiring Overseer and Priest of Ancient Lore. I think both sides of this effect are fine, and the combination of both of them makes this a pretty good common. I'll give it a C+. Next up we have Tyrant of Care Ridges, which is 4 and 2 red for a 4/5 dragon at rare. It has flying. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to any target, and in case that wasn't enough for you, you can pay a red to have it get +1/+0 until end of turn. Well, this is just ridiculous. This gives me Glorybringer vibes, and I hate how this is just a rare, because this card will feel so bad to see resolve on your opponent's side of the battlefield. It's a 6-mana 4/5 flyer that kills a creature on ETB that can attack for like 7 or 8. This is one of the best rares in the entire set in my opinion. It's an A+. Next up we have Unleash Shell, which is 3 and 2 red for an instant at common, and it deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker and 2 damage to that permanent's controller. I see what you did there. I might just rename this card to Unleash Hell, because obviously that's the joke here. But anyway, here's our clunky 5-mana red removal spell. It does what you need it to, but it's expensive. I think a copy of it is fine though. I'll give it a C. Next we have Visions of Phyrexia, which is 2 and 2 red for an enchantment at rare. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. And at the beginning of your end step, if you didn't play a card from exile this turn, you create a tapped Power Stone token. So this is 4 mana to draw an extra card each turn. And it even gives you a buyout of a Power Stone if you don't play it. We've seen effects like this in recent sets, including things like wiretapping in Streets of New Capenna, which actually underperformed a little bit. It all depends on the speed of the format with this one. If it's a fast format, you just don't have time for this. If it's a slow one, it'll be great. My expectation is for the format to be pretty fast, actually, especially with all what we've seen out of red so far. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a D. Just know that this is another one of those cards with a wide range of outcomes. Next up we have Whirling Strike, which is 1 and a red for an instant at common, and it gives target creature +2/+0 and trample and first strike until end of turn. Well, here's a combat trick. You know how it goes with these? Include it if you need a combat trick. It's a fine one. I'll give it a C-. Next up is Blitz Automaton, which is 7 mana for a 6/4 artifact creature construct at common, and it has haste. And it has a prototype version that you can cast for 2 and a red to have a 3/2 with haste. So here's our common red version of these prototype creatures, and I think this one might be just a little underpowered compared to the rest. Now that being said, it does look like red has a lot of Power Stone makers from what we saw, even more than the other colors, and maybe that makes this like 5 or 6 mana 6/4 haste. Either way, all these prototype cards are still pretty good, and I'll give it this one a C. Next up is Falai Dragon Engine, which is 8 mana for a 5/5 with flying. You can pay 2 mana to have it get +1/+0 until end of turn, and its prototype version is 2 and a red for a 1/3 with the same text box. A 5/5 flyer is keyword huge in the format, and even though its ability costs 2, it's kind of like it still only costs 1 with Power Stones. I'm not super excited about the prototype version on this card, but if you resolve the larger version, it demands an answer quickly. I think I'll give it a B-. Next up is Heavyweight Demolisher, which is 7 mana for an 8/6 artifact creature construct at uncommon. It has Menace, and it says that at the beginning of your upkeep, you have to tap Heavyweight Demolisher unless you pay 3 mana, and it unearths for 6 and 2 red. So the 3 mana upkeep requirement is no joke with this card. Now, if you've got the 7 mana needed to cast it already, it's probably not as big of a percentage of your total mana pool as you might think, but it is still 3 mana. The good news is that you may only need to pay that once or twice because an 8/6 Menace will either kill them or trade for 2 or 3 creatures pretty quickly. Plus, its unearth is probably the final nail in the coffin for your opponent. I think its downside keeps it at a C+ for me though. Next up is Mishra's Juggernaut, which is 5 mana for a 5/3 Juggernaut at common. It has Trample, and it attacks each combat if able, and it has Unearth for 5 and a red. Juggernauts have some nice nostalgia in MTG, but I don't think they really hold up in Modern Limited. This one does have Unearth, but I don't think that's enough to make me really want to include it. I'm giving it a D+. Next we have Mishra's Research Desk, which is 1 mana for an artifact at uncommon. You can pay 1, tap and sack it to exile the top 2 cards of your library. You choose one of them. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card, and it unearths for 1 and a red. This card reminds me a lot of Experimental Synthesizer from Kamigawa. I wouldn't play this card unless I had access to red for its unearth ability, and it's nice that it sacks itself to work with the synergies in the format. Don't forget that you can also wait until the end of your next turn to play that card as well. I think red-black decks will love this card, and I'm giving it a C+. Next we have Phyrexian Dragon Engine, which is 3 mana for a 2/2 artifact creature Phyrexian Dragon at rare. It has double strike, and when it enters the battlefield from your graveyard, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw 3 cards, and it has Unearth for 3 and 2 red. So this card looks very similar to Ox of Agonis from Theros Beyond Death for me. Not quite as good because Unearth is worse than Escape, but a 3 mana 2/2 double strike that can be some card draw later in the game is great. The little symbols in the top left and bottom right indicate that this is one of the meld cards in the format, but we don't really care about that too much for Limited. I'm giving it a B. Next up is Scrapwork Mutt, which is 2 mana for a 2/1 artifact creature dog at common. When Scrapwork Mutt enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, you draw a card, and it unearths for 1 and a red. So we have a 2 mana 2/1 that rummages on ETB that gives you another rummage later. This ETB rummage effect on an underwhelming body usually underperforms a little bit, but the unearth is nice. I think in red decks, this is slightly less than where you want to be, but it's still fine. I'll give it a C-. And our last red card is Skitterbeam Battalion, which is 9 mana for a 4/4 with Trample and Haste. And when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you create 2 tokens that are copies of it. It also has a prototype version, which is 3 and 2 red, for a 2/2 that also has the same text. Geez, 9 mana for 3 4/4s with haste? That's basically game over. I think this reads 9 mana win the game. And with Power Stones, it's basically like 7. It also does a decent little overrun impression with its prototype version by creating 3 hasty 2/2s. If you can reliably cast this, and that's a big if, I think this is an A-. Before we wrap up here, I did want to mention that there are 63 additional cards in this set that will appear in booster packs on MTG Arena called Retro Artifacts. These cards are similar to the Mystical Archive cards that we saw in Strixhaven in that there's guaranteed to be exactly one of these in each pack. All 63 of these cards are reprints, and I will not be including dialogue in any of my set review videos going over each of these cards. However, if you're interested in my grade for these 63 cards, I've included those grades in the description of this video. That'll do it for today's portion of the Brothers War set review. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you tomorrow for more daily draft content.